Is it like, no, AI costs are going to come down because chips are going to get better and all that, and it'll just be like EC2 or any of the other services or something?
There's almost like an arms race in hardware, right? Where, NVIDIA every year is going to push out another new graphic chip, and then and they can only produce so many per year, right? So then each one of these providers is going to start trying to grab up as much as you can, right? And that, I think that's going to be like the hindrance to having the prices come down as fast as they normally do.
AI will build it for you and we'll provide you that AI. Like, hey guys, agents are coming. And don't even worry about forget the concept of building applications. Like, use our agents and you're going to be fine.
I wouldn't say people are souring on Kubernetes. I think it's just
it's not exactly the realization aspect of it.
It's more realization. It's like, hey, maybe this is not everything that we need it to be, or I need to invest a lot more for me to get the most out of it.
Yeah.
So now they're looking more at like, can we get in? Are there other containerization things or other services that are kind of simplified and maybe kind of almost fewer choices?
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Technocratic Podcast. Today, our guest is Ray Yin, a longtime cloud ops and engineering leader. Ray has led a number of different types of teams over the years in cloud and engineering, as well as consulting. He spent time across a bunch of different verticals, including stints at Booz Allen, Visa, and the edtech firm Hobson's. Ray and I have known each other since back in 2018, I think, which is incredible how fast time flies. He was a rock-solid leader in our cloud ops team, and I was super impressed by not only how good his technical skills were, but his skills and ability in communicating with the business side. We're really excited to have him on the show today. Welcome to the podcast, Ray.
Hey, thanks for having me, Bobby. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So, Ray, you're our resident cloud ops guru. So we're going to just jump right into it. Cloud has been seemingly undergoing lots and lots of changes. We're in January 2025 right now, but what did you see that were the big trends happening last year in cloud? Like, what changed a lot? And like, what do you think is going to continue on maybe in 2025?
No, absolutely. I think there's not just last year, but even last couple of years, there's always been a big push towards serverless. So everything's serverless now. You have serverless storage, serverless compute, just to make it easier for developers to just build new applications and get them more agile and more into the whole DevOps mindset. But now, especially at the tail end of 24 and 24, it seems like most of the major cloud providers, whether it's AWS or GCP or Azure, hopped on the AI train, right? So it's been a lot of the new announcements have been more AI focused, whether it's on the model side or the building side or just serving side, right? And I think that's going to be obviously continuing into 2025, where AI is in everything. Now it's just really about how are you able to make it easier to build, make it easier to manage, and how do you incorporate it into even your core product lines.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's been a huge, huge thing in cloud. What about other stuff? Like, you hear a lot about the newer like observability tools that have come out. What do you think of this new crop of applications for observability?
Oh yeah, it's speaking of AI, it's like it changes the game about what you have to worry about in order to make sure your application is working. So if you think about like the last generation of observability tools, right? You had your logging tools, you had your APM tools, and you had like all your metric tools, like the Datadog and the Relics of the world. But then if you try to apply that towards some of these new AI either frameworks that are being pushed out there right now, whether it's like LangChain, LangFlow, Flowise, or even with existing cloud provider AI tools like Bedrock, right? Those traditional tools only give you insight into your own code, and you really lose a lot of the visibility into how the APIs you're using, whether it's OpenAI or some of the other Hugging Face or even Bedrock, or how they're applying and how relevant they are. right? So some of this new outcropping of observability tools are really designed to kind of tap into those new frameworks and hook into and get some of the metrics around like how accurate are your LLM models, how many times are your customers complaining about the accuracy of what the results are, and another piece is cost management. It kind of changes the game about what really drives the cost. It's not about compute anymore, which is fairly simple to track. It's now more focused on, hey, how many tokens are you generating, and like how quickly are you generating those tokens, and which models are you using? Right.
That's a huge new thing now. Yeah. Exactly. So, okay, serverless was big, of course, the march to serverless. AI, huge, better observability tools to not just like observe the traditional services, but also now monitor and track AI related stuff like model usage and things like that. I think I heard you say, we were talking at one point in the last couple of weeks, and I think I heard you say something about like maybe Kubernetes isn't as popular or was flattening out its popularity. Where does that stand these days, just with like the developer, cloud ops, DevOps community?
I think it's definitely a mixed bag depending on the size of the organization. Like I was saying previously, I would say probably 4 or 5 years ago, like Kubernetes was a new hotness, and everyone was like kind of going on the bandwagon. Hey, this would solve a lot of problems, right? And it definitely can.
Right.
But then as the cloud providers started making it easier to deploy Kubernetes, which all of them now have like native Kubernetes platform as a service that you can just deploy, people started realizing that it's also very complicated to upkeep Kubernetes in terms of like various plugins, how you set it up, and it just became uber complicated, right?
Yeah.
And there's just a lot of decisions that a team has to make to like customize it to their needs. And that's just a lot of overhead that a lot of teams just didn't want to take on anymore, right? There wasn't a like kind of rubber stamp that you could just use. So I think that's where I wouldn't say people are souring on Kubernetes. I think it's just
it's not exactly the realization aspect of it.
It's more realization. It's like, hey, maybe this is not everything that we need it to be, or I need to invest a lot more for me to get the most out of it. Yeah. So now they're looking more at like, can we get in? Are there other containerization things or other services that are kind of simplified and kind of almost fewer choices to do things and just simplify the developer workflow? And I think the big thing is really about the developer experience, right? So you want to kind of remove a lot of that complexity out of the SDLC, right? So make it easy for your engineering teams to get the code out there. And if they have to think about like, okay, what's my YAML have to look like, then you're kind of losing the game there.
Yeah. That's you nailed it. One thing that I remember talking to you about back in the day in 2018 was like how close DevOps should be to engineering teams, and should DevOps teams be or resources be embedded in engineering teams. And 2018 seems like ages ago now in the world of like cloud ops. How have things evolved? How are you seeing like organizations set up their like cloud ops and DevOps teams? Are they embedding them more closely with like core engineering groups, or is it still pretty separated, or what are you observing out there?
I think it still is. It still spans the spectrum because it really does depend on like how mature you are in your DevOps journey, because it really is a journey, right? Where you kind of have to start out with having dedicated DevOps teams, right? Just to kind of organize everything. And then you move into having embedded individuals into engineering teams to kind of shift the responsibility down to engineering teams to say, hey, it's not just, you can't just shift operations to a central team. We need you to start making changes internally. But I think the latest trend for the last probably like 4 or 5 years now has been more focused on like making it scalable within larger organizations, right?
Yeah.
Where, it makes sense to have like embedded people if you only have a handful of Scrum teams, but when you have hundreds of developers, it just doesn't scale, especially if you want to maintain some sort of cohesiveness in terms of how you standardize certain processes and stuff like that. So the big push or the big trend right now is more towards having platform teams. So you have your engineering teams who are still have some level of operational responsibility in terms of their individual application, but then you push some of the more complicated, like enabling technologies or processes to a dedicated platform team that now providing those services to your engineering teams, right? So things like, a Kubernetes platform, right? Where they simplify it down to like, hey, you don't have to understand the entire YAML dictionary of what Kubernetes needs to be. You only need to like maybe a handful of like key items that you just care about to control your deployment. Or another good example would be like CI/CD, right, where you provide a set of kind of templatized CI/CD workflows or that the team can just use instead of having to worry about like how do I build my code, how do I like do my artifacts and all that fun stuff. You can just, and now you have a easy way of making changes and deploying those changes and really reduce the amount of mental capacity that a developer has to have in order to just do their job, right? So they can focus more on solving the engineering problem.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, that reminds me. I saw something the other day. There was a company that just got something like 80 million in funding from like a bunch of great investors like Bessemer Partners and stuff. And it was an organization that was their claim is they're like the next crop of cloud providers where even all the AWS stuff is now like raised up another level of abstraction layer. So
yeah, absolutely.
It feels like we see these every few years, like, oh my God, we're going to make developing software even easier now and stuff. Do you believe in those startups more? Are you starting to believe in those startups more because like maybe now AI is going to help make that more of a reality? So they could just like, is it possible to disrupt AWS? Like, is that even possible?
I don't know if you would disrupt them per se, just because just the sheer scale of what they have in terms of services and offerings and just like the compute power alone is just going to be very hard to disrupt them. But I agree. I think I think what you do is you can complement them and build on top of them, right? To make it easier for people to start using, ultimately use AWS on the back end, but not know that you're using AWS.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Because, using AWS is a very complex endeavor to take on. There's just so much knowledge you have to have up front before you even build your own, before you even deploy your first virtual machine, right? You do the networking, security, all the fun stuff, right? So I think
there is an opportunity, right, to make it easier for developers.
Absolutely. I think if what some of these the opportunity really is in building a platform on top of AWS that now you can provide out to the development community to make it easier. So like, hey, you don't have to know anything about containers. We're going to deploy in a container, but you don't have to know it.
Right. I think this company, I wish I could remember the name, but it's like only been out for the last couple of years. And they sort of have a video on how easy it is to build apps on their infrastructure. I'm pretty sure they're sitting on AWS right now. But there's been a lot of companies that kind of claim that. And for a little while, you see a like slight uptick in their popularity. But then everybody falls back down to AWS again. Why do you think that is? Is it just because like, oh, well, the applications are so complex that people are trying to build that you have to know AWS to build it right?
I think ultimately it comes down to scale, right, and performance, because everyone has to make a compromise when you build your platform, right? So there's certain capabilities that you will allow inside your platform for hosting, and there's certain capabilities you just won't allow, right?
Right.
And I think it also limits your the technologies you can use, right? Because there's a lot of native AWS services that are awesome, like SQS, like SES, where like I don't need an email service anymore. I don't have to build that. I can just leverage what I have in AWS. And a lot of these platforms just don't give you access to the things, right? So I think it works best for like a startup or a very early stage company as you're building, and definitely use these providers because they'll get you up a lot faster. You don't have to have as much knowledge about cloud per se, but you get a lot of benefits, right? But then once you hit a certain level of scale in terms of like, you need more storage, you need more compute, you need to really re-architect your application because it's just like I'm moving from a monolith to a microservice, and now I do need all
you need to know something,
right?
About AWS at that point, exactly. So a lot of startups I know are starting to use some of these easier, like kind of out of the box obfuscation layers, basically for AWS or Azure or something like that. But it's in pockets, and like you said, it's in startups. One thing that's not as much of a startup question that I get a lot, and I'm wondering what your take is on. We were just talking about Kubernetes and where it's like trend line is going or whatever. And you mentioned serverless also continues to be obviously a big deal in cloud. How do you answer the question of whether or not when a company says, we want to move to using Kubernetes. Look at all of the cool things Kubernetes can do. How do you, as like the head of cloud ops, or me and you work together advising companies too, how do you advise companies to make that decision? Because it's such a big decision, it costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time. How do you decide something like that?
I think it really comes down to like how much are you willing to invest in it, right? Because it's not just the initial investment, it's the long-term maintenance of that platform, interpret capabilities and the upgrades and all that fun stuff. And are you moving to Kubernetes is not just about, hey, I'm changing my compute platform and it has my scalability components. That's definitely a benefit, and there's a lot to it. But then, like we were talking about previously, there's a lot of complexity inside of Kubernetes. There's a lot of different ways of doing the exact same thing inside Kubernetes. So you really need to have a dedicated team that's focused on making sure that platform not just runs well, but is kind of catering to the needs of your engineering teams, right? Are you providing the features within your Kubernetes platform? Because that's really what it is. It's just a platform that you own. Is that platform providing what your engineering team needs in order to build more efficiently?
Right. Yeah.
And if you do, then go ahead and do it. But if you are just thinking like, hey, this is a one-time investment and I have this thing and it just works forever, it's like, no, the upgrade cycle. There's a huge upgrade cycle for Kubernetes.
Right. Absolutely. And maintaining it is a very costly endeavor. When companies come to me with this question or with this proposal, they're like, hey, we're moving to Kubernetes. It seems like it's always difficult for them to answer the question of like, what's the upside, in terms of like the business value being created. So I'm always saying to them, hey, if you do this, are you going to improve like the time to market for your software? If you do this, are you going to improve the uptime of your software? If you do this, will you be able to efficientize the cloud ops team? If you do that, and I think that when companies can frame the Kubernetes migration in that kind of what business value is going to generate, it's so much easier to sell it then, sell the idea of it. The other thing I'm curious about is, are there specific kinds of applications that you've now seen ever since serverless came out that you look at it and you're like, that whole thing needs to run off serverless? Is there like, can you give some examples or ideas about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think any event-driven type of application, perfect for serverless, right? Where you're not just waiting for a message to come through and then you act on it, right? Those are the best ones. And I think whether it's like, a texting application where you're having like asynchronous conversations going on through text and having the serverless be like your intermediary back into your application. Perfect use case for that.
Serverless seems like it has continued to thrive and grow, and a lot of companies use it. They don't always know when to use it right, but one more question before we move deeper into AI. Costs. So I remember back in the day when like the promise of cloud was so wrapped up around costs and the whole pay-as-you-go model. And of course, like as a CTO, I just think that went completely out the door so fast, It's like, it's just as expensive as anything else on-prem. What do you think about the rising cloud costs and that most companies seem to be incurring? Is it going to get better, or are we just on a ride into like infinity and beyond on costs? Like, what do you think?
No, I think it can get better as long as you understand like what the cloud is good for and what's not. So like you look at you see some of the news, some of the latest articles out there of like big major companies that are like basically moving out of the cloud and spending like and saying they're going to save like millions of dollars a year.
Going backwards,
right? Exactly. Yeah. Like I think Basecamp is like
oh really? Wow.
Yeah, okay. I think it went out of the cloud.
Yeah.
But I think part of the reason is because cloud is really great if you have unpredictable workloads, right? Or you have very spiky workloads. Yeah. And what I've seen with companies that have these, like you said, ballooning cloud costs is they don't have that. They're very static, and they keep the machines on all the time. So basically, they're running the cloud as an external data center at that point, and that is going to cost more than if you just had your own VMware farm.
Right. Yep. Exactly. So I had a friend who runs technology for a company, and he moved from on-prem where I think they had like 2 or 3 racks worth of machines, like Linux machines, and he moved to Azure, and Azure was giving him all kinds of discounts and promising all sorts of access to things. And it was just like, it was so appetizing that he was just like, I got to do this.
Yeah.
And like 5 years later now, his costs are higher than if he had just stayed with his own hardware. And so then, as you alluded to, like you see all these companies kind of going back to their own data centers and stuff. And you look at it, it's nowadays, it's so easy to do the math on total cost of ownership of one or the other and stuff. Yeah. So you can just make a math-based decision pretty quick. But the most CTOs there's comfort in being in the cloud. There's just like psychological security, compliance, and regulatory comfort just to be in AWS or in Azure or something like that. In your opinion, should cloud ops leaders, CTOs, should they play more? I don't want to say fast and loose, should they take more risk on and go backwards in quotes and be on prem, but then deal with the security, compliance, and other factors, or is it worth it to just pay one bill and take care of all that?
Yeah. I think if you have the scale, definitely consider it. It's definitely it's definitely worth the investment of a research effort to see if it works well for you, right? Because again, there's definitely big savings in not being in the cloud if you're a big enough organization. But if you don't, I think where the cloud shines the best is when you do have like a smaller like cloud ops organization, and you don't have like 5,000 employees. You only have like a handful of employees, and the cloud makes a lot more sense because, like you said, you can offload a lot of that compliance and just worry about like your individual pieces and and your own security perimeter around your resources. But yeah, definitely, it's a, like you said, is basically just a mathematical equation that you just look at, but you just have to be very thorough with your analysis. And it's not just a hardware cost, it's not just a maintenance cost, it's the people cost, because you now have to hire people who know these new tools. You have to know all the compliance related settings that you need to have, and all the security response around that too.
Yeah, exactly. It's easy and it's not easy to make the comparison. Like, I guess at the end of the day, so many things factor into it that you don't want to just like decide based on, I think, like my friend, like, oh, here's the like incentives we're getting from Azure, so we got to do this or something. I think you have to be careful, right?
Yeah, and I think another thing too is like you got to look at your tech stack and like how embedded are you in the cloud?
Right.
Like if you're a heavy user of SQS, well, guess what? You're going to have to create your own queuing mechanism now.
That's right.
Like, do you want to run RabbitMQ? If you do, go for it.
Yeah. Or my favorite, what was it? Redis. Is Redis a queuing system? Yeah, or that was maybe a key value store.
Caching system. Like, do you want to run all those additional services? Right?
That's right. That's a huge part of it. Yeah, you have to be an expert and you have to maintain all that. I've always wanted to ask you this. I invest in a bunch of startups. When should a startup hire its first DevOps engineer or cloud ops engineer? Like, how do you know when to do it?
Oh, man. I would say as soon as you have enough infrastructure for them to manage or to manage. If you are able to get like a unicorn and have like a full stack developer, they're very rare, even though there are a lot of people that say they're full stack. It's a very rare resource to find. Snatch that person up because they will try to get you on the right foot.
Right.
But I think once you get to like, 4 or 5 developers and you're kind of releasing at a regular cadence, I think that's the right amount of time where you need someone in there who's going to be more operation focused, who's going to be worried about, like, am I going to take a downtime when I do this release? Or like, do I have data consistency when I do these operations? Right. And how do I make the CI/CD pipeline more efficient? You need some focus on that just to kind of scale out the productivity of your small team.
Yeah, exactly. It's weird because like companies are so loath to kind of startups, a lot of them are so hesitant to spend money on like a cloud ops engineer right away. They'll hire a bunch of developers, they'll get a bunch of customers and be like, oh, holy crap. We need somebody who understands cloud. And I also find it fascinating that companies often like don't get that that just like there's no room anymore to, I think, just have your core engineers and nobody else. I think you have to have some operational people. Now, I think if the next generation of AWSs that are going to come out are going to make it even easier to develop apps, okay, cool. If you're developing like on Heroku, I don't know if you ever played with that platform, but I made like a small app for like, I love cars. So I made a app for like managing your fleet of cars and stuff like that. And I didn't need anybody who was, really a cloud ops person for that because of the way Heroku is designed, but also because of the way my app is designed and I only have 1,000 users, customers. So it's like, oh, that's not a big deal. But if you're in a serious enterprise, a game of building an enterprise app, you need the cloud ops person sooner rather than later. But I still think 10, 15 years into the world of DevOps, CEOs don't get that. They don't know. They understand what a coder or what a developer is, but they don't understand what a DevOps person does. Like,
And I think that's like the bane of like being a cloud ops or operations focused person is it's very hard to get other people who don't know what you do to understand the value of what you do, and especially when in most cases if someone knows my name, that means something bad has probably happened and they need me to fix it, right? Yep. So there's always that negative connotation that comes around, like, why are you here? Right? So and again, I think there's also a very specific mindset of person who can thrive in that type of environment, right? Because you got to enjoy the chaos, right? Because your life is going to be very chaotic, not by design, but it's just like it's the nature of the beast, right? Something's bound to crash on you on some demo or something, and like there's always an emergency somewhere, and you just have to be able to thrive in that environment and just kind of get down to the root cause and try to fix it. Right?
Yeah. That mindset thing is pretty major, because it's not as easy as people think to like get into DevOps or get out of DevOps. Like, there is a mindset of a person who's fighting 15 fires at the same time, you know.
Exactly.
Whereas like an engineer, software engineer, maybe takes out 4 hours of quiet time, slaps on the headphones, sits in like a Starbucks and like writes code to their heart's content. Very different from a typical day of a DevOps person, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And like most of the people I've worked with in the field, like they don't seek the attention. They don't need the glory. They just want to like get their job done, and like they want stability. Right. And that's what drives them to like make all these changes and like put all these systems in place.
That's right. Exactly. Now, obviously, the DevOps role is changing. And maybe it changes quite a lot because of AI. Like, where do you see that going? Like, do you think that there's going to be near-term impacts? Or is it already happening from AI, near-term impacts? Or, like, what's your take on that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think just like how developers are kind of, like, leveraging AI as a tool, it's happening in the DevOps world, too. Because whether it's, like, infrastructure as code and helping you write the latest your CI/CD pipeline to do a certain thing, or getting your Terraform to do a certain thing, you don't have to do like hours of research anymore. You can just kind of ask OpenAI or Gemini and say, hey, give me a template that does this, and then you can kind of pick and choose which pieces you want to use to kind of get you the kickstart that you want.
Yeah.
Another great use case, honestly, is around just troubleshooting in general, where it's like I have Gemini enabled on my Google searches, so like I'll literally just stick in like error messages into into Google, 100%. And Gemini just like, based on this error message, here's how to fix it, right? And
that's awesome,
and it's a huge help, right?
Yeah, that's huge. I've seen a lot of people also just, there was a guy who was planning on migration from. I think it was a very highly scaled application, and he was wanting to migrate. He was a VP of engineering, and he was wanting to migrate from. I think it was either from MySQL to Postgres or Postgres to MySQL. And this guy, he's a VP of Cloud Ops, and a lot of his plan came together through interaction with ChatGPT helping him out. And like when I looked at the plan, I was like, this is a really thorough plan. Like, you've accounted for everything in here and stuff. It was because he got the help of ChatGPT. So it's like at an individual tactical level, managerial level, is starting to get into the world of DevOps. Do you think, if we just think in almost near sci-fi terms, are we going to get to a point where, like, everybody talks about how AI is going to replace product people, AI is going to replace software developers, AI is going to definitely replace, people say it's like a definite replace QA people. But I don't know if all that's true, but when I think about cloud ops, or DevOps people, it seems like some of the least replaceable people. Because of kind of like the nature of the work, where it's like so configuration oriented. But maybe there's a counter argument to that. What do you think, like 2 or 3 years from now, will we still have DevOps people?
I think we will, definitely. I think the tooling and the AI will get better in terms of, if you kind of go back and forth with the AI on your design to like refine it. Definitely don't just stick a prompt in there. It's like building this stack with like components A, B, and C and just run with it. Right? You definitely have to refine it. And I think over time, the amount of refinement will probably go down, right? Yeah. But it's like you said, it's going to be very hard to replace a good DevOps engineer or a CloudOps engineer, just because there's kind of institutional knowledge you have about your particular application and its quirks, and why you would not want a certain setting somewhere. Right?
Absolutely.
Because it'll break.
Yeah. Those like quirks, that knowledge is really valuable. I mean, it comes in handy every day, right? Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Now, the big AI companies, I'm sorry, the big cloud providers are turning into big AI providers. Like they provided all these services. Now they're like, all right, AI is just another service. Yeah. And here's Bedrock and here's Azure's version of Bedrock and all that type of stuff. Do you think that those AI-based services and things, or AI-oriented services, are they going to start to make up the bulk of these companies' revenue streams over time? Or is it like, no, AI costs are going to come down because chips are going to get better and all that, and it'll just be like EC2 or any of the other services or something?
If Amazon and all the other cloud providers do what they typically do, is when they scale, they usually get cheaper. So that's definitely, I definitely think that will continue to happen. The only caveat to that is there's almost like an arms race in hardware, right? Where, NVIDIA every year is going to push out another new graphic chip. Right. And then they can only produce so many per year, right? So then each one of these providers is going to start trying to grab up as much as you can, right? And that, I think that's going to be like the hindrance to having the prices come down as fast as they normally do. But at the end of the day, I think it's more of it'll be a significant portion of their kind of like bottom line, but it's not going to kind of overtake it because it's going to be mostly compute, right? Because you still need hosting for like the rest of your application, right? AI is going to be a chunk of it, but it's not going to be the whole application, right? So there's always going to be other compute needs, other storage needs, other caching needs. So I think the percentage will grow, but I don't think they're just going to become AI companies because there's just way too much other dependencies out there.
Yep. What about this? Talking about the cloud providers, this like recent news that like the OpenAI relationship with Microsoft's not that good, and Sam Altman doesn't like the Microsoft AI guy. I think his name is like Mustafa Suleyman. Like, how real is that in your estimation? And does OpenAI become a multi-cloud company, or is it still going to stick to Microsoft?
I think in the short term they have to, just because of just the pure amount of investment Microsoft has put into the organization. Yeah. But no, I think long term they definitely do need to diversify their who they work with, right? Just because the market itself is so huge, right? If they kind of stick with Microsoft, they're really limiting what they can and can't do. Right?
Yeah. Yep, they are limited, and Microsoft's not going to share their secret battle plans with them or something. They'll still have their own shareholders to worry about. It's interesting that, and I never would have thought 15, 20 years ago that Microsoft would be one of the cool companies right in the middle of like the AI talk. And like, I think a lot of that is because they did really well with Azure. Like they positioned themselves so well. They were getting crushed in the beginning by AWS, but in the last 10 years, they've gotten so much better and competitive, and that's enabled them to, such a huge moneymaker for them. They can do a lot more with like this OpenAI relationship that they have. And I personally think that, I think Microsoft and OpenAI will just kind of go their own ways over time, but it still is a true thing. I think that Azure is such a powerful platform on which to evolve Microsoft's AI aspirations and vision. How did Azure kind of catch up to AWS? Do you think it's even caught up to AWS for most companies? Where do you think that Azure versus AWS competition is headed into?
I think they're actually fairly close to parity, right? And like you said, I think probably like 8 years ago, there's no doubt in anyone's mind that if you want to do anything of scale, you went to AWS, right? And the reason you're in Azure is either because you're a pure Windows shop and it just makes more sense for you to be in Azure, or Azure gave you a ton of credits to move your stuff into Azure right? But I think I think they made up they spent a lot of money like on the hardware and on the people and the services to just initially it was just, hey, can we do what AWS does? Right, in terms of, do we have an S3 equivalent? Do we have an SQS equivalent? And stuff like that. So it was just more of like keeping up with the Joneses for the first couple of years.
Right.
And now I think they're getting to a point where, they're kind of pushing the boundaries in terms of like new services, in terms of like, how they're managing their AKS, how they're making access available to some of the new AI libraries, and like how do you kind of build your own models inside of AWS, and giving exposure to those new services, right, natively. And like personally, there are certain things about Azure that I actually like better than AWS in terms of like their permission model. Like in the hierarchy, it's a lot easier to manage permissions inside of Azure than it is in AWS. It's just one of the things that just frustrates me to no end.
That's funny. I never thought you'd say anything nice about Azure, but there we go, the permissions model. Yeah, you're right. They basically caught up to the base services and then started differentiating themselves, which is pretty. I mean, it's pretty par for the course, but they did a good job on it. They poured in a lot of money. It seems like they started packaging Azure a lot better. Like, so when they make their pitch to companies I'm involved in, it's just as good as AWS versus what it used to be before, where you were just going to Azure to save some money, maybe. It's fascinating too that like. So I think Andy Jassy has his own opinion about where AI is going, and then Satya Nadella has his own set of opinions about where things are going with cloud and AI. One thing that seems to kind of tie both of them together, and then also like GCP, of course, and all that, is that these guys, it feels like, I'm just reading between the lines here, they want to leapfrog, I don't know, leapfrog's the right word, but they want to evolve from like the being at this like bottom abstraction layer to being like skipping almost like that application layer, easy to build stuff, and jumping right into the AI will build it for you and we'll provide you that AI. Like, hey guys, agents are coming. And don't even worry about forget the concept of building applications. Like, use our agents, and you're going to be fine. And if you can, and they're almost like wanting to provide this ability to stitch together 20 agents to do the job that previously would have done by spending 2 years building an enterprise application. Now they're just like, all right, use these agents to do it. My thought on that is, I'm like, okay, well. I don't think a lot of companies are going to be fast to adopt that mindset. I think companies are slow. Their customers are slow. They're used to like typical enterprise applications where you point and click and stuff. And right now, when you come to OpenAI, ChatGPT, it's just like a black screen with a little empty chat window at the bottom. I mean, yes, it's a very successful product, but I guarantee you that's not the way most people want to interact with like their screen, is an empty thing that just, where do I start? What do I say? What do I do? And I feel like the big cloud providers seem like they're loving that. Maybe it's just they're riding the hype cycle of AI agents and all that. I don't know. What do you think about all this?
No, I agree. I think I'm the same boat you are. I think they're definitely riding the hype cycle to a point, and I think another thing they're not really taking into account is like they're dealing with their target audience for the people who are building these applications are engineers. Yeah. The engineers want to tinker. They want to know what's underneath that, like underneath the hood, right? And everything's a black box once you say like, okay, this agent talks to this agent, and out comes a thing that you can just deploy.
Right.
It's just not as satisfying. It's great when the agent says, hey, here's some code, and then you can tinker around with, right? Yeah. It's a totally other thing of, hey, here's this application fully formed. I have no idea how it works, but it's giving me some answers.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's a good example. Okay, got one more question about the big AI and cloud providers. These sort of second, third tier, I don't want to insult anybody at IBM, but IBM's got a cloud offering. I mean, not many people use it, know about it, but they do. Google, I guess, is up there. Oracle is another one. So IBM and Oracle, Do they have any chance in catching up to like an AWS or Azure, or is a ship sailed on that?
In my opinion, it's kind of failed. I think OCI from Oracle has made bigger leaps than IBM has, but some would argue that that's because they're giving a ton of credits to Oracle customers to try out OCI. So like you already have the Oracle license, here's some credits to use OCI to host it with, right?
Yeah.
So and that's I'm not knocking them for it. It's like that's how they have to grow it right now, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's also one of those things where you can say they're kind of catering to like niche audiences, right? Where if you're an IBM customer and you're already using IBM services for something else, and then why wouldn't you use IBM's cloud? Because if you're using Watson to build out the application, you have to use IBM's cloud to use Watson, right? Or like if you are an Oracle provider or Oracle, you rely heavily on the Oracle database to get your application out the door, whether you're running SAP or whatever the case may be, then why wouldn't you host it in OCI? Because they're giving you a cost savings to do it, right?
Yeah. So there are some compelling reasons for some subset of companies, but a typical mid-market company is not going to go rushing to Oracle. But the way Larry Ellison talks about Oracle OCI is like, it's the greatest thing in sliced bread. But yes, Larry Ellison. I wonder if this new announcement about Stargate and improves Oracle's standing, or what does it do to Oracle's standing? We don't know enough probably about Stargate yet to answer that, but it's interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah, it definitely is. I think they're probably in position to take more risks than AWS or an Azure or a GCP, just because they don't have as much to lose because they're already kind of like number 4 or 5 in like the top players in the cloud. So they can take some of these gambles and say like, okay, if it works, great, we're gonna make a ton of money. But if it doesn't, it's like, okay, you lose a couple $1 billion for a couple of years and move on, right?
Yeah, exactly. Do you think that the GPU companies are coming out where they're just like totally focused on AI and 1 billion% invested in making like the best data centers for AI, or is that going to be a thing in the lives of most companies in the next few years?
I think the GPU side, I'd be interested actually to see if others are able to kind of rise to the level that NVIDIA is, right? They clearly have the lead, and it's going to take a long time for like whether it's like AMD or Intel or whoever to come up with like a better graphics chip that can compete with not just the chip itself, but also the CUDA API that they built on top of it. That's kind of like the secret sauce. Right. But I think the market is big enough just because of how much money NVIDIA is just making off of their graphics processors right now for someone to come through. It's like, hey, I can make a better chip. It's just it's just a huge hill to climb, right? Because it's not just the hardware; it's the ecosystem around it.
Yeah. Or even, Ray, the companies that want to compete with AWS and offer just like high density GPU focused computing environments. Like they go and they buy either NVIDIA chips or AMD chips or whatever, and they make data centers just focus on AI based applications. And if they can make their own version of Bedrock and they have their own partner with NVIDIA to have their NVIDIA chips, and they could kind of create like a mini AWS that's just exclusively focused on AI. That could be pretty cool in the next few years.
No, absolutely. I think that the where I'm not fully sold on that purpose is that who's the market for that, right? Because most of these providers are like OpenAI or Anthropic or whoever. They have their own things and they're doing their own thing, stuff, whether it's on AWS or Azure or whoever, right? And the only time you would really need that type of compute is if you have like a huge data store that you need to basically build your own models on. Right. And don't get me wrong, there are tons of companies that have that need to have very specific models just for you. But there's just a finite number right now because just the amount of data that you would need to be able to even make use of that is quite small in the grand scheme of things. Right?
Yeah. Let's see what that sort of develops into. Ray, last question, which is if you're giving advice to somebody who is, let's say, the director of cloud operations, they're running a small team, but they've got this job opportunity where they can run like a 20, 30, 40 person cloud ops team, $200 million, $300 million company, huge jump up for them in salary and responsibility and all this type of stuff. What would your advice be to somebody like that who's going from a director to a VP, who maybe has almost a seat at the executive table, perhaps, certainly working closely with the CTO? What are some of the things that they need to master to be successful in making that leap and staying at that VP level? I mean, the way you have, man, you made the leap and you've been going from one thing to the next. Like, how should people be successful at the VP Cloud Ops job?
Honestly, the first thing you need to have is you have to understand the business. Like, how does your company generate value? And then figure out how does your cloud operations team facilitate that value, right? Whether that's like taking away obstacles, improving processes, reducing costs, because that's a big chunk of it, is just understanding the business to see like where can you cut to make the most bang for your buck, but also not reduce service levels to a point where like now your developers are complaining that, hey, I can't do this thing anymore because you didn't buy this piece of software, right? So it's a delicate balance, but step one is understanding kind of like how your business makes money and how you can help them.
Exactly.
The second piece is more of you have to be able to collaborate, right? Because at the end of the day, your customer is the rest of the company. It's not your external customers. They may benefit from what you do, but your day-to-day customer, or whether it's
everybody else in the company,
exactly,
product
teams, engineering, everything else, right? So, and they're relying on you to do certain things for them, right? And granted, there's going to be give and take in there in terms of like, you have to balance security with like cost, with everything else that's going on and like resourcing, right? But at the end of the day, it's more of how can you collaborate with them so they understand kind of what value you bring to them. And then like, and more importantly, that they can confide in you. It's like, hey, I have this problem. Right. And they're trying to solve on their own, where if you just kind of gave them a little help, it becomes a lot faster, a lot better, just a lot more efficient. Right? So
Man,
I think
those
those
are
are
awesome
the two
tips.
main things you have to do.
Yeah, that's really good. I would add, and this is just from like what I've seen a lot from you and maybe a few other good cloud ops leaders, but like you have to know something about cost management because it's becoming so expensive AI itself is such a big factor in expenses going forward for CTOs like me and you. And so cost management, you have to be good at that. If you're just good technically and you stink at cost management, you're going to have some problems as VP of Cloud Ops. I think that's a huge one. And then also, I think personally, it's like you have to also know something about like applications. You know what I mean? Like it's becoming so much more of a thing where like the head of cloud ops meets so much more frequently with the head of product or the CTO or something like that. And knowing your applications, of course, is you have to, that's a basic table stakes. But like even in like the future roadmap of the product and what's your product strategy, where is it going to go? Like I feel like cloud ops leaders contribute to that stuff way more than like 5-10 years ago now. You know what I mean? Would you agree?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I've looked at more code in the last like 6 months than I had in like the last 5 years.
Exactly. 100%.
No, absolutely. I think the cost thing definitely, because beyond just cloud costs, it's like it's really getting to like what are the unit economics of how we even host. Right. That becomes huge, right? Because then you can start contributing to like roadmap discussions. You can start contributing to like architectural discussions and like. Part of kind of what I tell people is like, hey, I'm a jack of all trades, a master of none. Like I know a lot of stuff about a lot of things, but like I never claimed to be an expert software developer. I never claimed to be an architect. I say it all the time to people. I'm like, I'm not an architect, but this is what I think is wrong.
Reminds me of that commercial about, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV.
Exactly.
No, but yeah, I think that's so true. Cloud ops people are so underrated almost. Like they know about QA, they know about engineering, they know something about product, they know that all these aspects, they're so often cloud ops people are given the job of internal IT. Like you go and become the enterprise IT guy. Make sure the laptops all have endpoint security on them. So it's like you guys have to do everything. It's actually nuts how much responsibility you all have. But anyway,
I think that just goes back to kind of saying like there's a lot of chaos that happens in like a DevOps and cloud ops day, right? And you kind of have to know all those things because like any one of those pieces could break, and you have to figure out like, oh, that's why it broke, and whether talking to the team to fix it or just say like, hey, I see this bad piece of data, I think it's this thing. Can you at least validate it when I think it's right?
Yeah. All right. That's a perfect note for us to end on. I think we're at the end of our time. It was a pleasure talking with you today, Ray.
Yeah, it was great talking about it.
And I'm sure our listeners will have taken a lot from this discussion. So thank you to everyone for joining. I'll see you next time on the Technocratic Podcast. And in the meantime, keep the sharks swimming.